Brian.
Okay, yeah, just back to the overview slide. So we'll be covering off 3 items today. First, a very quick review of how to develop an effective advocacy plan. You may remember if you joined us earlier this year in May, I went through in quite a bit of detail how to develop an effective advocacy plan or advocacy strategy. And that webinar is available on the CCSN website. So I'm going to do just a quick review to frame up what we're going to talk about for the balance of today. But if you want more detail, I encourage you to go and check out that that webinar from May of this year. Secondly, we'll go over how to tell your personal story, either as a patient or caregiver, or speak of what we call your personal experience if you are a volunteer or a staff person within an organization, and also if you are a healthcare professional. And then finally, we'll spend the bulk of our time reviewing how to advocate in person from start to finish and everything in between. And again, just as a reminder, which I do for all of my webinars, that while I'll be concentrating my comments on advocating to government, the concepts that I'll be discussing work equally as well, irrespective of who you're advocating to. The principles are exactly the same. So whether you're advocating to your child's teacher or your spouse's physician, it doesn't really matter. These concepts work equally as well. It's really about advocacy as a life skill that you can use in many facets of your professional or personal lives. Next slide. So how to develop an effective advocacy plan. This is a 3-step process that you, as either an individual or as part of an organization, can start doing right away to create an actual advocacy plan that you can then implement in support of your issues. And it's these 3 steps which I'll walk you through now just very quickly. First, we talk about, next slide. First, it's identification. And this really requires you, as it says there, to distill, to take an array of information and distill it down to its simplest form when you're developing your key messages. So this is about identifying essentially what it is that you want to say. It's also important that if you're doing this as a group, that you reach a consensus on what it is that you want to say and how you want to say it. Next slide. Framing your key messages. Many issues can be very broad, complicated, and multi-layered. So when we talk about framing an issue, we're really referring to determining which aspects of the issue you want to focus on and therefore build your key messages around. So one of the sample approach that we often use, and again, it's contained in the in more detail in the webinar from earlier this year, but is the 3 key messages have a flow to them along the following lines. The first one says or outlines what is the problem or a part of the problem that it is that you want to bring to the attention of the decision maker or the person that you're advocating to. Secondly, what is the impact of the problem? We call this the sort of what's the big deal key message. Just because you tell somebody you have a problem doesn't necessarily or inherently mean that they understand the impact of the problem. So the second key message will often iterate in some detail what the impact of the problem is. And then finally, the third key message is what could be the result if the problem were solved. And then that proposed resolution, as it were, or outcome of as a result of a resolution is the bridge to your ask, which we'll talk about in a moment. So first key message, what is the problem? Second one, what is the impact of the problem? And third one, what would it look like if we were to resolve the problem? Next slide. Once you've got your 3 key messages, this represents the core of any effective advocacy strategy. Anything that you have or produce that may be used to communicate with people is a potential tool. And it includes things like letters, in-person meetings, like we're going to talk about today, petitions, postcards, social networking tools, all kinds of different tools that we use in various ways in order to support and put forward our key messages. And then finally, the next slide is your one ask, because you're going to ask for the one thing you need and not a list of what you want. For those of you who've heard me present before, you'll recognize those words that I always say and always repeat, because you're going to ask for the one thing you need and not a list of what you want. It's about having a very clear focus on that one ask that you have of the decision maker. And then finally on this slide, and this is very important, your ask needs to be tangible. It needs to be something that's real. If you're not asking for something that's real, if you're not asking for something that's tangible, you're not doing advocacy. So you don't ask for somebody's support. You don't ask for somebody's help. You don't ask for somebody's commitment, because those words don't mean anything. You have to ask for something tangible. You have to ask somebody to write a letter. You have to ask that a piece of legislation be amended. You have to ask for something that you can prove and see that it has occurred as a result of your engagement. Next slide. So let's get into beginning our discussion around advocating in person. These are the first steps to preparing for your meeting. In addition to your 3 key messages and your 1 ask, you need to determine who will be attending the meeting that you're going to. And one of the rules that we have, with very few exceptions to this rule, is never go alone. Never go to a face-to-face meeting with a decision maker alone. The reason why we suggest this is very simple. Because 2 sets of eyes and 2 sets of ears are better than 1 set of eyes and 1 set of ears. And different people will have different interpretations of what happened in a meeting. And it's important that you have at least 2 people in that meeting, so that they have somebody to discuss the outcome with and reach some kind of a determination as to how the meeting went, how it was received, and potentially how you should move forward. If you go by yourself, then you have nobody to bounce off any interpretation with. And that can be a real drawback depending on the circumstances. As well, depending on the circumstances, it could be any number or combination of people, but one of the people, must be a person who can tell their personal story around how the issue that you're addressing is impacting them. So it's this idea that at least one person in that meeting is able to say, we're here to talk to you about this issue, and I want you to know how this issue is impacting or affecting me or my family, and I'm going to tell you my personal story, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then further, especially if you're meeting with politicians, at least one person should be a patient, at least in the context of healthcare. It's really important that one person is a patient. There are circumstances where the person who tells their personal story isn't necessarily a patient. It could be a caregiver, for example. But one of the people in that room needs to tell a personal story, and one of the people in that room, could be the same person, needs to be a patient in the context of this work, like I said, in healthcare. Next slide. So before we go on and talk sort of the detailed piece around advocating in person, let me just pause for a second and talk a bit more about personal stories. I'm going to review how to tell your personal story in an in-person meeting with a decision maker. And again, this decision maker could be anyone, depending upon the issue that you're advocating for. But again, in this case, I'm going to use a politician as an example of who you could be advocating to and telling your personal story. Next slide. Although everyone has a personal story to tell, or again, in the case of a healthcare professional or staff people, we talk about sharing their personal experience. As I said, at a minimum, the patient or caregiver present at the meeting will share theirs with the decision maker. So in addition to what I have on the slide there for your review, I won't read it to you. Let me just add a few more important points. Number one, a personal story is personal. And that should seem obvious to you, but I've read a lot of personal stories written by people who don't use the words I or me or my, and that's not a personal story. A personal story is about you. It's not about your family. And so you need to use the words I and me and my. And this can be a real challenge for a lot of people, especially people who are not used to talking about themselves. It doesn't mean that your personal story doesn't weave in, obviously, your family, your friends, other loved ones, and that kind of thing. But it can't be an overview of how everybody else felt, how everybody else reacted, and nothing to do with you. you have to be a part of your personal story. Again, it seems obvious, but it isn't necessarily the way people are often comfortable in writing or communicating. Next, a personal story is important. It is what fuels the logic of your key messages and your one ask. It's absolutely critical because it what seeks to connect you with the decision maker is through your personal story. And finally, it's supposed to be emotional. And remember, emotional doesn't mean sad. Emotional means that you take the time throughout the personal story to tell the person you're advocating to how you felt, good or bad, happy or sad. It should encompass all of your emotions over the period of time that you're speaking, because we all experience various emotions over the period of our lives, obviously, but even necessarily over the period of time that you may be talking about, whether it's a year or two or longer. And so by being emotional, it should be compelling, but it also needs to be believable. There is no point in exaggerating how you felt or exaggerating your circumstances in some kind of an effort to seem dramatic. That's not what this is. It's about being accurate, being clear, but also not being afraid to share your emotions. Again, good and bad, in the context of communicating your story. Next slide. I don't know how many of you have ever written out your personal story as it relates to any aspect of your lives, but you need to do that if you're going to be a patient advocate particularly, or caregiver as well. It's essential. It's essential because we all forget things. It's of course an ongoing story that you'll always be adding to, and you're going to need to create versions of your story, as I've noted above. It's also essential because you are allowed to read your personal story. A lot of people put a lot of effort into crafting their personal story, and then they find themselves in front of a decision maker, let's say a face-to-face meeting like we're talking about today, and for some reason they don't think they can read it. For some reason they think they need to just sort of wing it and try to say it off the top of their head. But that's not true. You can read your personal story if you want. That's fine. Other people don't feel comfortable reading it, and that's fine too. My point is that when you put in the effort to craft it, to choose the words, to frame the sentences and the paragraphs, that's because it's meant to be communicated as written. Otherwise, you can just do bullet points if you want, refer to them and tell it. But it's fine to read your personal story. Because remember, it's not a test. It's behind closed doors. You don't have to be perfect at it to be effective. Sometimes reading it can be the most impactful way to do this. I've seen people read their personal stories and have the greatest impact you can imagine without having to be concerned about having memorized it or anything like that. So just to finish up on this slide, as it says, you may not have thought of it this way, but you really have two choices. Given, for example, 5 minutes to tell your personal story, you can either do a summary of your entire story as it pertains to the issue, or you can tell a portion of your story that really focuses on one or two aspects of an issue. So, whatever it may be, the around diagnosis, for example, you can focus on that if the issue that you're talking about has to do with diagnosis. Or access to medication, so you would focus on that. But the real point here, and what you need to sort of remember, is that the version of your personal story that you tell, whether it's the 5-minute version or 4-minute version of your entire story, or whether it's just a portion of it, needs to connect with the issue that you're talking about. So if you're there to talk about challenges around diagnosis of a disease, don't talk about medications. They're not related. Medications may be part of your story and you could quickly reference it, but the focus of your story needs to be on or around the issue that is the one that you're there to talk about. Next slide. So just back one more, telling your story, the last one there. Yeah, essential elements, exactly. So when I started doing these personal stories with people, I just assumed that everybody would sort of be able to frame it up in a certain way, but of course that's not true. So these are some of the essential elements that you may want to include in a personal story. So the sort of name, age, where you live, occupation, family, that kind of thing, those first two bullets there are really just meant to kind of establish a baseline or a reference for the person to whom you are advocating. And then usually the next one is kind of timing and circumstances around a diagnosis. Now, it may be that, for example, you're dealing with an issue where somebody was born, for example, with a particular, like a rare disease or something like that. That's a little bit different. But usually, in most cases, it's kind of like I was going along, I was living my life, and then something happened, something occurred. And that brought about a fundamental change that had me sort of entering into the healthcare system. That's often or usually how it sort of evolves. So it's just a matter of capturing all of this in a chronological sort of way. You want to talk about the challenges faced as a result of the disease, again, particularly around the relevant issue. And again, challenges doesn't necessarily mean everything that's bad. Your personal story is not about all the things that have gone wrong. It should be a reflection of all of your challenges and all of the things that have gone well and perhaps not so well. What you believe the government needs to do to help you and others. So obviously there needs to be a connection between the fact that you're telling your personal story and what the government can do to assist you. And then, of course, at every point, how you felt. We've already talked about that, and the importance of ensuring that the emotion that you felt at the moment in which you're talking. So if it's 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 3 weeks ago, whatever it is, that's the emotion that is captured and presented to the decision makers. So if we move to the next slide, we'll go back and talk specifically now on an ongoing piece around getting around face-to-face meetings. So you need to decide going in, I will not give up until I get my meeting. So you need to be realistic about who you need to meet with. But one of the things that we suggest is that call first. So for example, if you're meeting with your provincial member of parliament, call their constituency office first, but most people will want something in writing. Most of the constituency assistants, for example, will want to ensure that there's something in writing. So have that email ready to go. Have it ready. And that way, while you're on the phone with the constituency assistant and you say, look, I'd like to meet with my provincial member of parliament, and that person says, well, you'll need to send in a meeting request, you can say, well, actually, I've crafted an email right now. Can you give me your email address? I'll send it to you right now, and I'll wait on the phone until you receive the email. Now, if you do something like that, a couple of things are going to happen. First of all, it's going to be very clear to the person on the other end of the phone that you know what you're doing. And secondly, as a result of knowing what you're doing, that you can't be ignored, and that you will have a much higher probability of getting a meeting in a relatively quick manner if you know what you're doing. Follow up, follow up, follow up. It's really, really important that you follow up to get your meeting. This is not about I put in a meeting request either on the telephone or in writing, and I'm waiting and I'm waiting and I'm waiting and nothing's happening. If you want a meeting, get the meeting. It's your responsibility to get the meeting. It's their responsibility, particularly with elected officials, to meet with you. No argument about that. But it is your responsibility in the context of this exercise to follow up and ensure that you get the meeting. And finally on the slide, if you're offered a chance to meet with somebody else, this is not an alternative. So for example, if you're trying to meet with a politician and you're told, well, the member's out of town for the next 3 weeks, but you can meet with a constituency assistant, for example, or somebody else in that person's office, that's fine. Take the meeting. It's actually really good practice. So take the meeting, but continue to pursue the actual decision maker that you need to get to, the person who can actually affect the change that you require, and not simply somebody who is a substitute or a proxy for that person. So moving on to the next slide, before the meeting. Sending material ahead of time, it's not unreasonable to assume if you send any material ahead of time for somebody to read, especially if they're a politician, that they will not have read the material. This is very typical. Although it may be, for example, if you're meeting with a minister, that a bureaucrat will have read the material and potentially prepared a briefing note. But any material that you send ahead of time should be brief, simple, and deliver your 3 key messages. Don't forget to always weave your key messages through any of the content that you are presenting. You are competing with every other person and organization that person is meeting with that day, that week, and that month. I hesitate to describe it this way, but it is really true. You are in a competition. You're in a competition for people's attention. And then secondly, you're in a competition for them to actually do something as a result of having gotten their attention. So you've got to be impactful. It's important, of course, that you know the participants, that you know who they are, that you've done some research, you've done a bit of due diligence around the person or the people that you're actually meeting with, so that you understand who they are. And in terms of the length of the meeting, make sure that you always confirm how long the meeting is for. I have had many circumstances where people will tell me, oh, we got a meeting with so-and-so, and I'll say, well, how long is it booked for? And they don't know. Well, you can't prepare if you don't know how long the meeting is for. So most meetings are 30 minutes. Typically they're 30 minutes, although that can vary depending on the circumstances. But if you get a 30-minute meeting, and this is the point I want to make here, prepare for a 20-minute meeting. Prepare for the person to come 5 minutes late and have to leave 5 minutes early. If you script this down to the exact minute of 30 minutes, then you could be in a situation where you're going to get cut short and you won't be able to complete what it is that you want to do. So prepare for something that may require or that may result in less time in terms of you being in front of this person. Next slide, the number of people that you bring should reflect to some extent the number of people on the other side. And all I'm suggesting by that is, and this particularly goes, for example, with larger meetings or meetings where you're involving multiple people in government, bureaucrats, and that kind of thing. If they're bringing 6 people, don't bring 2. And if they're bringing 2 people, don't bring 6. There should be some measure of parity. It doesn't have to be an exact number, but there should be some measure of parity, or should be some measure of parity in terms of the number of people that are in attendance from both sides. Make sure everyone has a reason for being there. And one of those reasons, for example, could be to take notes. Also make sure that everybody knows why they're there. I cannot emphasize this enough. It's really, really important that everybody understand why they are there. I've often given the example of a meeting that I had when I was in government. It was myself and the minister and 2 people on the other side. And it so happened that these people were there to talk about a policy issue related to the ministry we worked in, but they also happened to live in the minister's riding. They were constituents. It was just a happenstance. But before the meeting started, or just as the meeting was about to start, the one person on the other side said, Minister, before we start and talk about this other issue, I wanted to talk to you about a stop sign at the end of my street. And you could see the person he was sitting next to become visually agitated by the fact that his colleague had decided to preempt this meeting with a discussion about a stop sign. Aside from the fact that the stop sign in this case had nothing to do with the provincial government's jurisdiction, the minister and this gentleman proceeded to talk about stop signs for 15 minutes. Half of the meeting was spent talking about something that had nothing to do with why they were there, nobody was prepared to talk about, and it completely derailed the meeting. And his colleague was rather upset, I could tell, having as I was sitting across from him. So everybody needs to know why they're there. They're there to talk about the issue at hand. If you want to talk about something else, book another meeting and talk about that in another meeting. But stay focused on what it is that you're there to talk about. And then this combination idea you'll see from the 4th bullet on the slide in front of you. We've had very good results with this sort of mix of people. It's not critical. You don't always have to have this combination, but it's actually one that's quite good. We'll often suggest, for example, and this particularly goes with larger meetings, for example, with ministers or with bureaucrats, but we'll often suggest, for example, that there be a representative from the patient organization, somebody who can speak to the larger issues, the larger impact around a particular disease or whatever the issue is, and bring that macro perspective. The second person in the room is a physician or a clinician or somebody who can speak to what I'll call the clinical or technical issues around whatever it is that you're discussing. And that person needs to be qualified to do so. You as a patient may have tremendous knowledge about an issue. You may have more knowledge than most physicians do. There's no argument about that. But you're not qualified to talk about these things, at least in the eyes of most decision makers. And so having somebody who is qualified and competent to do it can be very important. And then, of course, finally, and most importantly, somebody who, as we've talked about, is impacted, a patient, a caregiver, or both, somebody who can tell their personal story and who can really bring home the personal impact of whatever it is that is being discussed. So again, doesn't always have to be this combination, but I throw it out there for your consideration because it can be very powerful. Next slide. So at the meeting, the good news is you've got your three key messages. You've got the right combination of people in front of the decision maker you need to see, and you're prepared. The bad news is you've really got 1 minute to make an impact. We call this the 1 minute rule. The 1 minute rule essentially asks you to, in 1 minute, say who you are, who you represent, why you're there, what you need this decision maker to do for you, and how, and if appropriate, what you can offer in return. If you do this, you will have distinguished yourself from 99 out of 100 external people that person will ever meet with, ever, because we don't communicate this way. We don't tend to communicate in this very direct and succinct manner, and yet I would suggest to you that is exactly what's warranted in most of these situations. If you don't do this, especially when you're advocating to a politician, they'll still be there in body, but trust me, their mind will have checked out, and they will not be as focused as they would be if you can do that. In terms of what you can offer in return, again, not all circumstances lend themselves to that, but there are certainly circumstances that do. One of the typical ones that we'll often engage around is, for example, if you're meeting with your local member of parliament or provincial member, whatever it may be, take a moment to ask them, for example, to attend one of your upcoming events or do a profile of them in a newsletter that you may be putting out or whatever it is. This works obviously for groups sort of thing. And that is, in a sense, this idea of what you can offer in return. You don't say it like that, but what you're essentially saying is, I'm here, I'm engaged with you, and I'm also prepared to bring something to the table, for example, like profiling the work that you do in the community in our newsletter, as I said, or having them come to an event. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about, just to be clear. Next slide. We talk about sort of presentations. I'm not going to spend really a whole lot of time on this slide, in part because in most cases people don't use PowerPoint and that kind of thing, but sometimes they do, and I will just address this very specifically. When do you use PowerPoint? Well, if the issue is complicated, particularly complicated, if you don't know any of the people that you're meeting with, you really have not been able to kind of figure out who these people are. If there'll be 6 or more people in attendance, if it's a large sort of group, because that way you have something for everybody to focus on, and perhaps they're less likely to be on their phones or looking out the window and that kind of thing. And if any of the people you're meeting with are bureaucrats, we still recommend in general, unless it's just a very casual meeting with 1 or 2, but certainly if you're meeting with a group of bureaucrats in the context of government, I would tend to use PowerPoint, or at least I would give them something visual to look at. Because again, it helps to focus their attention. If you're not using PowerPoint, then just bring something along. We generally try to suggest that you bring some kind of piece of paper or something along for people to again reference or look at. And of course, make sure that you sort out technologies ahead of time and prepare for failure. I've seen too many circumstances where people did not have things were not set up, and it took an inordinate amount of time to get a presentation up and running. So next slide, in terms of the actual presentations, you need to be results or resolution focused, not complaints focused. You're going to talk about why things need to change around your issues, but don't end there like most groups do. Present solutions, present actual solutions. Tell the person how they could do this. I've been in meetings before where there's been these wonderful presentations, and one in particular I remember, and the minister turned to this group and said, I understand what you want me to do, but I'm not sure how to do it. How do I do this? And their answer was, well, I thought you would know. That's not a great answer. That should never be your answer. The answer should be, well, here are some ideas, minister, some suggestions about how you might want to go about doing that. And you're prompting a dialogue. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have the final solution. But that's why I say present solutions, present options to initiate a dialogue to reach an ultimate solution that you're agreed upon in terms of moving forward. Assign someone to watch the time. That's very important in these meetings. Time flies by so quickly. Somebody should have an eye on the clock. And finally, assign someone to pull the meeting back if it goes off the rails. This is your meeting. You need to control it. You need to, I don't want to say aggressively control it, but you need to assertively control this meeting and not let it go off the rails and not let somebody take it off and meander somewhere that doesn't serve your objectives. Take control of the meeting, keep control of the meeting moving forward. Next slide. In the actual meeting itself, effective advocacy is about presenting, listening, and responding. Presenting, listening, and responding. So if you hear yourself talking continuously, you need to stop talking. And this is tough for a lot of people who feel very passionately about what it is they want to communicate. But if you don't stop talking, you're letting the decision maker get away with not having to say anything and therefore not address your 3 key messages or your 1 ask. As well, don't be afraid, as well, in addition to what's on the slide here, don't be afraid to ask questions. There's nothing wrong with asking questions. Again, you might wonder why I'm saying this, but again, it's based on my experience. I was in a number of meetings where I know the people who we were meeting with didn't understand what was necessarily being said or the road that the minister was going down, but they didn't seek clarification. They didn't ask questions. And you should always ask questions because that's the only way you're going to get the clarity you need to be able to move forward. So on the next slide is a bit of a sample agenda that you can follow. And we talked a little bit about this before in terms of this combination, but this is just a really rough outline of something that you could consider. So obviously your introductions, delivering your key messages, your 1 ask kind of thing for 5 minutes. Then a physician, for example, or healthcare professional will often explain what the disease is, if that's the issue, and the impact that the issue has on her patients, for example, so they share their personal experience. The patient organization will often explain what they do for patients and the change that they are advocating for, again, on a global level or broader level. And then the patient caregiver story will come in then. And then ideally, the patient, if this all really works out well, the patient will be the patient of the physician who's presenting and a member of the patient organization. Again, it's not critical, but my point is, if everybody actually knows everybody and everybody's interests are interwoven with one another, so the patient's a member of the organization that's represented, the physician is part of the organization, for example, perhaps serving on a scientific advisory council, and then is actually the physician of the patient, that's perfect. Again, not essential, but I just want to seed some of these ideas with you in terms of what you would ultimately be looking for, because then you have an absolutely seamless presentation around the issue that's coming forward. Next slide. After the meeting, you need to try to stay top of mind to the people that you're advocating to. And as I said, that's very difficult. That can be really challenging. But one way to do that is to show them that you are doing everything you can to help yourself or your issues and them or their priorities. So what I mean by that is that it is really unappealing to governments when people come in, essentially lay out the issue, and then say, help me. And they kind of stop there. Contrary to popular belief, governments particularly like to work with those people who help themselves because it's less work for them. So in that context, what you really want to try to do is come in and say, look, here's the issue, and let me tell you about we, or myself, my family, or our organization, or whatever it is. Let me tell you what we're doing to try to resolve this issue or to try to move this issue along. But we can't do it by ourselves. We need you to be part of the resolution here. And this is the part we need you to come in on. This is the role that we need you to play to move this whole thing along for us. That's very appealing because as a decision maker, it demonstrates to them that you're not just there with sort of hat in hand, helpless, wondering what they can do for you, but rather you're looking to enter into more of a partnership to try to resolve the issue. And then the second piece of what I just said has to do with them or their priorities. Before you go in to meet with any decision maker, it's really important that you understand what the priorities of the day are, for example, of the government or the opposition or whoever it is that you're meeting with. And this isn't difficult to figure out. It's all over websites and ministry websites and political party websites and party platforms and that kind of thing. Take a look at that stuff. Pull the language out that they use and try to frame your issue in a way that essentially says, if you do this, if you help me with my issue, it will help you with your priorities. It will help you achieve your policy objectives. A win for me as a patient is a win for you as a government or as a party or whatever it may be, or whoever the person is that you're advocating to. So take the time to figure out their priorities and take the time as best you can. And this can't always be done. I don't want to suggest that this is easy. It can be very challenging. But where you can, try to frame, try to position your issues within the context of what it is that they've told everybody or deemed to be their own priorities. Next slide. So just as we sort of reach the conclusion here of the presentation, let me go through in a little bit more detail around sort of the difference between advocating to politicians and advocating to bureaucrats. The first slide here around advocating to politicians, what we suggest is that when you're advocating to government, it's almost like climbing two ladders at the same time. I wouldn't actually do this, but just metaphorically. The first ladder represents the political branch. The second ladder represents the bureaucratic group. And you want to ascend up these two ladders, 1 foot on each, in relatively the same manner. In other words, you don't want to get too far ahead or too far behind in your engagement with either the people on the political side or the people on the bureaucratic side. So essentially, you want to build relationships with both politicians and bureaucrats simultaneously. So when you're advocating to politicians, obviously you want your key messages. You need to assume they know nothing about your issue. This is a bit of a summary of what we've talked about. Find out everything you can about them. Link to their objectives, as I just said a moment ago. Where possible, bring the issue down to the riding level or down to the constituency level. We've had really good success at not just saying, look, this is an important issue for the people of Canada or the people of British Columbia or whatever it may be, but let me bring this down to show you that this is an important for an issue for the people that live in your community and that you represent in the legislature. So when you can do that, that's important. Position your issues within the context of the election cycle, and that's just the period of time between elections, and it's really important to understand some of the basics around that. So for example, governments will do things in the first half of their mandate they would never dream of doing in the second half of their mandate. You raise taxes in the first part of a mandate, you cut taxes in the second part of a mandate, just those kinds of things. Position your issue as a political win. When you're advocating to politicians, you can talk about politics. That's fine. That's the world they live in. So don't be hesitant to talk about things in the context of politics. You want to selectively engage the opposition, for example, that depends in part on where you are in the election cycle and whether, for example, there's a majority or a minority government. Keep them informed of your engagement with the bureaucrats. That's important. And then finally, and this one is very different than what you'll see in a moment on the bureaucratic side, but be prepared to be assertive or even aggressive if necessary. If you are still pursuing your issue after 5 years of engagement, you may want to become a little more assertive if it's warranted moving forward. So you can allow yourself on the political side to be assertive and aggressive if necessary with time, depending on the circumstances. If we go to the next slide, advocating to bureaucrats is a little bit different. Some of the stuff is the same. You still want to have your key messages and your one ask. You still want to find out about that person. But here you want to link your issues to government programs and initiatives rather than sort of the political mandate of the day or the political flavor of the day. You want to really align yourself with perhaps ongoing initiatives that may be 3, 5, 10, 25 years old kind of thing, because those are the things that the bureaucrats deal with. You've got to have people who can speak the technical language of bureaucrats. Bureaucrats can be extremely knowledgeable, very educated around issues, and if you need to get into a technical or clinical issue, you better have somebody who can speak to it and, as I said earlier, who is qualified to speak to it. Know where you are in the election cycle. That's still the same thing for bureaucrats, and keep them informed of your engagement on the political side. But the last point there is the most important one of all. Never blindside a bureaucrat. Blindside meaning never go behind their back and do something that they don't know about. You can blindside a politician. We do it all the time. You don't do it frequently. You don't do it, right out of the gate. But blindsiding a politician is justified in some cases. But you never, ever, I cannot think of an exception where you would blindside a bureaucrat, where you would go behind their back, where you would do something that they didn't know about that ran contrary to what they were trying to achieve. And the reason for that is simple, because they run the place. The politicians come and go, but the bureaucrats remain. They are the people that are there year in and year out, decade in and decade out in some cases. And they have long memories, and if you blindside them or you get on their bad side, you could be in the wilderness for, never mind 4 years with one government, you could be in the wilderness forever, or what is ostensibly forever, and never achieve what it is you're trying to do because you've made that mistake. And then finally, the next slide, our last slide, what not to do. I put this slide up, I guess, to some extent for your entertainment, but these 4 bullet points here are not just pulled out of the blue. These are all things that happened to me, certainly when I worked in government. As I'm sure you can appreciate, threats seldom get you closer to your ultimate goal. Always remember, there's only one government in power in any jurisdiction at any one time. There's usually only one person who can make the change that you want at any one moment, or one group of people at any one moment. This is not a matter of, I don't like Coke, so I'll drink Pepsi. If you don't like the Ontario government, you can't say, well, show me the other Ontario government. You can go over to the opposition, you can do other things, but there is a period of time where you either deal with these people because they're in charge, or you wait until somebody else is in charge. But ultimately, you decide how important your issues will be from a healthcare perspective in this country or in the province that you're dealing with. It's not predetermined. Your issues are not only so important and will never be any more important than they are today. They are going to be as important as you are. They'll be as important as you determine that they will be in the context of your engagement with these decision makers. So in conclusion, keep after them until your ask is fulfilled, and don't stop telling your personal stories to anyone who will listen. This will make all the difference in the world. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for another fantastic webinar. This is, I like the targeting of attending meetings is really timely with everything going on in government right now. A lot of people want to start advocating for their cause right now, and this is excellent advice. So we have one question coming in so far. I'd just like to remind everybody, now is the time to ask questions of Ryan if you have any based on his presentation. You can do so by typing into the little questions panel on your GoToWebinar panel. So the question I have here is, how do you determine who best to deliver your message to in order to make the biggest impact?
So that's a good question. So that really depends on what the issue is, and it may be more than one person. So as part of the due diligence exercise, you need to determine, so who is the person or who are the people that can affect the change that we require? So if it's amending legislation or creating a program or whatever it is, you need to spend some time, and this takes time, to figure out who within government, for example, on both the political and the bureaucratic side, would be responsible for making a decision around this. And sometimes that's not easy to do. It can be very challenging to figure that out. But presumably you'll get to the point where through trial and error and otherwise, that's often trial and error, and that's very typical, you will come down to a group of people who you need to engage. And then you want to make a contact plan, a contact list. And by the way, there might only be 3 people on that list. It doesn't have to be huge or anything like that. And then those are the people that you need to engage. Those are the people that you need to prepare your key messages and your one ask. You need to reach out to them. You need to, as we talked about today, book an appointment with them and have a face-to-face meeting. You may utilize other tools as well, but we're kind of talking about advocating in person today. Book a meeting with that person and go and engage them, kind of thing, and move forward with them. But it's really driven by the issue at hand. That's what drives who it is that you go and meet with. But let me add one more thing to that, which is important. If you're advocating to government, if your issue is with government, then usually you start with your elected representative, the person who represents you, in Regina or in Ottawa or in Fredericton or whatever it is, kind of thing. Usually we start with that person because that's their job. Their job is to represent you to the provincial government or to the federal government. So go and talk to them and tell them what your issue is and your key messages, and ideally you should have an ask, something for them to do. And that can often get the ball rolling, and then they can often be the conduit by which you can find other people in government, both on the political and the bureaucratic side, to further your issue and to ultimately reach whatever it is you're trying to achieve.
Thank you. That was a really great question. Before I get to the next question, I got a bunch of people here asking if you're able to get the slides after the presentation. Yes, you will. I'll go into that further once we're done the Q&A, but everybody will have access to the slides after the presentation. I know a few people came in late, so not to worry. This next question is a bit complicated. I'll go through it. In this current political climate, cost seems to be the biggest issue that's relevant to a right-leaning government. If we don't have cost savings and economic analyses for the issues we're advocating for, how else can we frame issues when we don't have the information that's most relevant to them?
So that's a really good question, and one of the big challenges that we have today, certainly in Ontario, but not necessarily just in Ontario. I guess the short answer is, and I was actually dealing with this just before coming on the webinar, the short answer to this is you really need to kind of pick your battles. You really need to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve, and does it fit within the context of the current mandate of the government. So if they require this information, then obviously you want to make all efforts you can to get it. If you cannot get it, and if you know that by not having an economic analysis or whatever it is that they require, you're not going to get anywhere, then you shouldn't go down that road. You really shouldn't. I don't have a better answer for you than that. If you know you're not going to be successful, then the way we do these efforts is they're set up for success. Your ask should always be set up for a yes, not a no. If you know that you're going to get a no to your ask, don't ask it. ask something else that's going to get a yes, or has a much higher probability of getting you a yes. So it may be, and this is part of the advice that we're giving to a number of organizations, particularly in Ontario, at least for the moment, and I say for the moment, we're pivoting to issues that aren't necessarily linked to money. And I know some organizations don't have any issues that aren't related to money, but if you do have issues that aren't related to money or directly related to funding, then those ones, even though they may not be all that important, should come to the forefront now and try to be resolved in the context of building a relationship with the government and being seen as a trusted partner. Then when the time comes, and the time will always come, it will always come, when the time comes that the environment is perhaps better or more appropriate or more opportune to go forward with your issue that perhaps is related to funding, then you'll be in a very good position to do so. This is not a perfect answer, but there are some real challenging issues going on with most of the provincial governments and the federal government now around funding. It's a very different circumstance than it was, well, a number of years ago, but even recently to some extent. And so that means that you need to adapt accordingly. To not adapt, to pretend that no, you're still just simply going to drive forward within some kind of artificial context, ignoring the realities that are facing the government, is foolish. You'll get nowhere. On the other hand, just every time government says to you, we have no money, you don't just run home and give up, because that's what they always say. Even when they have money, they tell you they have no money. So you have to strike that fine balance between being aware and adjusting accordingly, and not just being sort of pushed aside or shoved aside and told to go home because, you know, the cupboard is bare. That's you don't do that either, sort of thing. Okay, I hope that helps. It's a tough challenge, though.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question and not an easy one to answer. I think you did a pretty good job there, Ryan. Thank you. Our next question is also a really good one. So how do you handle situations where a politician or a bureaucrat has a conflicting view or values with an aspect or message in your presentation?
A conflicting view or value. Well, I guess you'd really want to understand and explore what that conflicting value is. Can a resolution to that conflict be brokered? I'm trying to think of an example in my head of where there would be this kind of fundamental disconnection between what you're putting forward in your position and what their position may be. Because I will tell you, at least on the political side, with very few exceptions, politicians can be swayed. I mean, sometimes it's pretty extreme stuff that gets them to sway, but they can be swayed. And on the bureaucratic side, of course, it can be more challenging, but it really depends on what the issue is. So I think you'd want to try to find out if there was some common ground, and if there isn't common ground, then you need to decide if you are prepared to compromise. Depending on the circumstances, it may be totally inappropriate for you to compromise, but are you prepared to compromise to some extent in order to get what you need? Are the values that are not aligned with what their values are so fundamental that you will forego what it is you're trying to achieve? Or is your objective, what you're trying to achieve, more important than aligning what I'll call fundamentally or strictly to the value in question? That's a call that you would have to make under the circumstances.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Our next question says, is taking a photo with a bureaucrat as acceptable as it is for a politician? Like, is it as acceptable to ask a photo of a bureaucrat?
Very good question. And the short answer is no. So generally speaking, when we do meetings and stuff like that, absolutely want to take pictures with politicians. In fact, it's a cornerstone piece I should have mentioned in this presentation. Absolutely, all the time, no question about it. And of course, they're politicians, so they love getting their picture taken. On the bureaucratic side, as I said, the answer is generally no, but there are a couple of exceptions. Where a bureaucrat is present in a public forum, for example, it's perfectly acceptable to ask to take a picture with a bureaucrat. That's okay. But even then, I would be really clear about asking their permission or telling them where you're going to use it. When you take a picture with a politician, we don't really bother telling them where we're going to use it because, again, their picture's everywhere, and they want their picture everywhere. So there's no issue. But with a bureaucrat, let's say you're at a public forum, you say, would you mind if I take a picture with you, deputy minister or whatever, take a picture, and then probably just out of courtesy more than anything else, let them know that you're going to be posting it on your website, you're going to be putting it in your newsletter, you're going to be doing this, and would they mind, and all of that kind of stuff. And in most cases, they shouldn't mind. But outside of, again, what I'll call a public forum, certainly in a private meeting with a bureaucrat, no, it's not appropriate. I'm not saying it's never done or that people don't do it, but it's not something I counsel people to do under typical circumstances.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.